Welcome to the Draft Deeper podcast. This is your host, Nathan Grubel. Joining me, as always, is my producer, Kevin Black. Steven is not joining us on this episode of the podcast. However, this man that is joining me needs zero introductions. He's been on this pod multiple times. I've been on his pod multiple times. The people love when we get together for content, and it's only fitting that we were going to have this man back on before the 2022 NBA draft. I'm sure I will be on his podcast before the 2022 draft as well. We always like coming together for discussion points around quote unquote our guys or our thoughts or our predictions. And so given that I'm doing an their guys or his guys or her guys podcast series with rotating guests, come on, chucking darts had to join me at some point. Chuck, how you doing, boss?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on. That was very, very nice. Yeah, when we did this for the 2021 draft on my feed, let's see. Jared Butler was one of yours.
Absolutely.
Isaiah Todd was one of yours. Trey Murphy, Josh Giddey, and Garuba were mine. Who was your third that you were stumping for?
Oh God, I couldn't even remember who my third was. But Todd sounds about right. I'm still in on that train. Jared Butler, I'm still going to be in on that train. But your Trey Murphy train. I mean, you got me agreeing with you to an extent. I did not end up having him quite as high as you did on your board. However, I saw a lot of the value that you were pining after. And by the way, oh, look who's playing big minutes for the Pelicans in the playoffs. Maybe not getting up as many shots as you'd like him to, but he's playing very well. The dart-friendly New Orleans Pelicans, as you like to say on social media.
The Darty Pels, yeah.
Before we get into like the guys that we're going to talk about tonight, any broad stroke playoff thoughts that you need to get off your chest?
Ooh, broad strokes.
Well, if you want to get into the Darty Pels, I mean, they can be minor strokes, but anything you want to get off your chest.
It's not that. It's more that it's really sort of, I don't want to say messing up, but it is constantly recontextualizing my draft work, the playoffs, because they're always important, and anyone in the draft community, we always like to say, we have our priors, we've done the homework, we've watched all the film. By the time, the college season's over, March Madness is over, you want to say like, oh, the work's 95% done. I am with all that. I respect everyone's grind, but when I watch the playoffs, I feel like my work has gone from 95% over to like 40% over. Like you just have to go back and watch everything in the light of what is working in the playoffs. And I think one thing in the playoffs that I am paying attention to is not like it's not reinventing the wheel or anything, but the sort of promise that has been out there in the NBA and in NBA draft circles for years about how everything is wings and you got to find wings and wings are the future and that's where the league is going. I think it's finally starting to be not just a necessity to have really good wings, but even if you have star guards, it's still that might mean that you're a first round team. If your offense revolves around a star guard who can't hold up on defense, then you might be in trouble. If you have a star big who can't switch onto the perimeter, then you might be in trouble. Admittedly, this theory would be better if the Raptors weren't down 3-2 to the Sixers.
I was guess, are you talking about my Sixers, Chuck?
Not specifically. I'm talking about how the Celtics, to me, are clearly the best team in a crowded Eastern Conference. I think it goes to that. I think the Miami Heat are probably the other best contender in the East for much the same reason. They were able to erase Trae Young a lot easier than I thought they'd be able to. With their defense. And out west, the West is a bit more varied in the teams that succeed, but like even the Dallas Mavericks, I did an episode on them with Lauren Gunn last week. because I think they're very underrated. And they don't strike you or strike me as the most switchable team ever, but their best lineups are, Luka's running point, and as long as they can hide Brunson well enough,
Brunson,
and
yep.
Brunson competes on defense, but he doesn't have wing size. Everyone else is kind of like sized, and once you have that lineup where everyone is more or less, 6'6" or taller, and you don't need to have the best defenders in the world. You just need to have guys who know their responsibilities and can execute a scheme. You just want to avoid being hunted. And like I said, not reinventing the wheel, but it smooths out draft eval a lot, because we're going to talk about one guard today, but he's a big guard.
Yep.
And these other guards in the draft, and I feel bad, but like Jaden Hardy and Ty Ty and Terquavion and Kennedy Chandler, all of them have things to recommend. Like I do see value in their games, but I watch the playoffs and I just wonder, well, where do they fit in? Where can these guys fit in? How good an offensive player do they really have to be to make sure that they're closing games? If you're Ja Morant, great. Yes, you can close games in the playoffs, no problem. But outside of that, it's very hard. So that's more what I'm looking at, how this wing revolution, and this is a very wingy draft. There's
Yep.
only more of these guys coming into the league. How the wing revolution is finally turning over a little bit. That's what I've noticed.
It's a deep wing draft when one of my like I can think of some names off the top of my head, but like one of my favorite wings in this draft, for example, is Marjan Beauchamp, and he's probably going to go in like the 20s. Some
Yeah.
mocks have even had him in like the early 30s. Like that's how many spots deep we might be talking in terms of wings. And I agree with you. I think really this playoffs has hit home now more than ever. You need guys who can make shots when the ball swung around to them, that they can do something when the ball comes around to them, and they can't be complete zeros on the defensive end. And some of those guards that you just listed off, Chuck, that would be their issue. They provide offensive value, but when you start breaking things down defensively, they need certain pieces around them to be able to make sure that they stay on the floor to do the things that they're capable of doing. Like Terquavion would be a comparison to like the Jalen Brunson in a sense. Like you have to play Terquavion next to a certain group of guys. Hardy is similar, although he does have the size to him, but he's potentially not as dynamic offensively in certain aspects. Like you'd like him to project him in like the top 10. Some might disagree with us on that, but I have Jaden Hardy like on my best days in like the back end of a lottery to like a mid first round grade. So there are just much more intriguing wing bets / forward bets that I think I'd rather make than some of those guys at this point. And we're going to talk about a few of them tonight. And let's just start with the player who, man, his stock could not be any hotter on draft Twitter right now. I feel like every third post I scroll through on Twitter has an Ousmane Dieng highlight reel or video clip, and it's for good reason. I've waited to go back and do my little quote unquote second half of the year dive on Dieng because I didn't want all of this hoopla and this hype to necessarily persuade me into coming around higher on him than maybe I wanted to before I watched the tape. Because as Tyler Rucker pointed out in one of our group chats today, like I don't forget the first half of the year for Dieng, right? Like I'm not going to forget some of the stuff that I watched in the first half of the year, but I went back last night in part in preparation for this podcast because you want to talk about him, Chuck, but also because I just needed to do the dive anyways. And I see it. I see exactly what everybody else is seeing. I have some concerns that I'm assuming we'll get into because you're a very deep evaluator, Chuck. Even when you say you haven't quite paid attention yet to the draft in some respects, as you usually like to. When you do an evaluation on somebody, you are incredibly detailed and you're very deep. So I have a feeling we're going to talk about all the points with Dieng. But why don't you just start by giving me your case for him and why you wanted to talk about him as one of quote unquote your guys?
Because in a draft of wings, he still is scarce.
Yep.
It's the simplest way I can put it. You know, at the NBA draft is this is something I wrote when I did my little final board write up last year. Is that the NBA draft at a certain level it's an exercise in scarcity. Can you get the rarest kinds of talents that contribute in the most important ways? And dialogue about the draft, most of the dialogue about the draft, and I don't want to completely straw man here, it focuses on, understandably so, focuses on like archetypes, players that remind you of other players that have succeeded. And sometimes that archetype work is very sophisticated, and there's tons of pieces that we can shout out to that effect. Other times, archetype work is a little lazier, and it's like, is this guy a 3-and-D wing? Stuff like that,
Yep.
stuff that lacks a little bit of nuance. Um, but if you look last year at that historic draft that we were all pumping up for months uh, before it actually happened, the
The
guys,
deepest draft in history, as you coined it, which I would agree with you. But by the
yeah,
way, but
thank you. But yeah, like when you look at that draft, the guys who showed out the most and that people are the most bullish on, it's not, when you think about it, it makes complete sense, but it's the guys who have the most skill at the most size with the most athleticism, which again, like not reinventing the wheel,
nope.
but with draft evaluation, I like restating the obvious. Maybe I'm unique in that, but I just like being like, I know X. And I know that Cade Cunningham and Evan Mobley and Scotty Barnes and Franz Wagner and Josh Giddey and Jalen Green all succeed to a degree because they're taller than other people at their position and they have guard skills, which you don't see at their size, at least not to the extremes that they have.
Yep.
And when you look at this draft and you look at Ousmane, the guy who sticks out the most at the top of the draft for having these kinds of skills, where you can really see him operating lots of pick and roll and really dictating offense for large stretches of games for a good team. That guy is Paolo. He's sort of the one guy who sticks out as maybe being able to do that in that capacity. And Ousmane, when I watched him for the Breakers this year, he is, by the way, almost not quite, but almost a year younger than Paolo. Playing in a pro league. To me, he has more. This is sort of a draft cliche, but he has more fluidity with the ball than Paolo. Paolo's more of a power player
Yep.
who is a bit more deliberate. I think Ousmane, though Paolo's a very good passer, Ousmane's movements are just a little quicker. He is a bit more slithery and he can get to his spots more quickly than Paolo can. And he's 6'10". Now he's not 250 pounds, but I think that his release is quicker. I like his shot a little bit more than I like Paolo's in a vacuum. And though I have Paolo higher on my board, there are people who are intrigued by Ousmane who are like, yeah, I see the skills. I'm a little tantalized. I get it. Late first round pick. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's he's a 6'10" guard who can get his own shot off the dribble and get to the rim, and has done it, albeit in the second half of the season, pretty frequently in a pro league. There are not 25 guys like that in the draft. There aren't 5. There aren't 3. So that's where I start. Is he does, and it doesn't mean he's going to be a great NBA player, but it
Sure.
means that if you have a pick in the lotto, you have to try to get guys like these, because the old adage of small market teams need to take a swing on stars, that's now, to me, every team. I don't know what team it is out there besides the Lakers with LeBron and the Nets with Kyrie and Kevin Durant who can really convince themselves to rely on free agency to land nuclear talents. It's just
Isn't it
not
a
how.
beautiful thing when the league is so rich with talent that you can no longer just slap 2 stars on a team, try and find player XYZ to fill out the roster, and you think you can win a championship with that team? Isn't it a beautiful thing, Chuck? I think it is.
It's great. I mean, and it stresses the importance of fit, and that goes back to what we were talking about at the top about what does the playoff show. Your team has to fit together. Your talent has to complement one another, and the best way to do that is to find versatile players who can do an assortment of things on the floor. And though Ousmane has his warts, and I'm not standing here saying or sitting here saying that he's like a no doubt top 5 pick, because I don't think he is. What the production he has shown and the things that he can do, you can see a version of it right at home on the futuristic Toronto Raptors. I mean, you can see how it would work. So that's where I start with him, is just the rarity of what he's got.
So my reservations with Dieng, I think, really all come back to the same point, is that he's 6'10", but this kid does not have the bulk on him to do a number of things on the floor. I think in a way it scares him away from going after the basket and looking to draw contact a little more to get to the free throw line, which he's also not the best of free throw shooters, but he really doesn't get there enough. Like, he shot 1.3 free throw attempts per game. So that's a way that if some of that comes around, that's an easy way for him to add to his scoring average. We talk about that all the time with good players. And then defensively, I don't think he's bad at defense. I think he's actually sneakily good in some respects, but I think where he could stand to get better isn't necessarily by development and feel on the ball or off the ball. It's with his body. If he could just absorb contact better and not let a lot of different matchups blow through him, I think he'd be a better defensive player. Like right now, if he were to go in the NBA, I think he's pretty locked into defending opposing twos. If you're telling me that Dieng can add safely like 15 to 20 pounds of bulk on his body and get stronger over the next few years, then I think some of the defensive concerns that I have go away. I think some of the finishing concerns / aggressiveness to get to the line goes away and or improves. And now when you start to put those things together, along with the pick and roll creativity that you talked about, the shooting versatility that you talked about, he's not just a spot up shooter. At his best, he can take 1 or 2 dribbles, pull up. I even was watching some film last night. He has really nice touch on a floater when he can get to it. And the last thing is, if he does get more comfortable getting downhill, going to the basket, doing all of that, I think it could naturally improve his shot selection as well. He stops settling for some of those fadeaway jumpers that you'll see him take, and he'll airball. I think it eliminates a lot of that as well. So they're like 3 different areas for improvement, but they all come back to something that I think is naturally going to happen. Like, I look at his frame, I don't see any reason why he can't safely add the weight that I'm looking for. I understand anytime you're dealing with like a 6'10" or bigger guy, you need to be very careful with how you go about that process, because that's where injuries can come into play if you add on that much weight too quickly. But if we're talking about over the course of a few years, and with the skill base that you're already mentioning, like, if that's the outcome that I can get, I said this today, I think he might be a no-brainer top 10 pick. And I think that's kind of where you're sort of going with your line of thinking.
It is. And I certainly understand that concern. Let me ask you, did you have similar concerns about either Giddey or Mobley? Particularly Giddey, since he played in the same league.
That's a great question. I did to an extent, but there are also some things with Giddey's shot as well as his touch that I wasn't a fan of coming in, which I think those concerns bore themselves out over the course of his rookie year. But I was not concerned physically with Mobley because I wasn't trying to project him as a center. I was always going to project him as more of like a power forward. And Giddey, I would project him more as like a 3-4 when his body fills out, like a 4-3, not necessarily like a 2, which is how he's actually played in Oklahoma City. So I was kind of like projecting not to where he's at right now. I think my projection was actually a little off because of how good he is on the ball. Um, Jang, I think if you're projecting him as like a 2-3 versus trying to like scale him up in certain matchups, I think you become less concerned. But my concerns with the body, I think if those could be wiped away, I think that's his quickest route, in my opinion, to becoming like a potential star, is to get the body stuff figured out so that he can absorb that context. They can get downhill, so they can get to the free throw line. That's in terms of like his star development. I don't think the 15 to 20 pounds that I'm looking for is important in the context of, I think he needs it to just be a good NBA player.
Yeah, and I think where you project him, that we going back to versatility, his creativity, his ball handling, and his shot, you can project him like I would project him as a center. I wouldn't project him as a four, but I could see him occupying anything 1 through 3 in a given lineup. Now, that's not to say that I think that he's going to be, again, like the primary point guard the way that,
Yep.
Luka Doncic is. He's not a heliocentric guy. But in a pinch, in certain matchups, if he has good wing defenders around him, I wouldn't rule that out. And that's just sort of the luxury that having ball skills and size affords you, is that you can fit in a number of different ways. Um, as far as my personal opinion about his bulk and his frame, look, I am not a biomechanics guy. I don't have that background, so I don't want to pretend to
Neither
be.
am I, which is why I tried to use the word safely, and I didn't want to get too far into it because I'm not an expert in that stuff either. But
Yeah, and so I'm not going to say one way or the other whether I think he will safely add bulk. I'll just say that I think it's rarer than it might seem for a skinny kid with this kind of size to stay skinny and get taken advantage of all the time at the NBA level. That's more how I come about it, is like, who has washed out because of their skinniness, if they have the ball skills, if they
right.
have the requisite feel and everything else.
And again,
And
I'm not
so
I'm not saying that he needs those. He needs that to be a good NBA player.
yeah.
I'm more saying it as a quicker path to quote unquote stardom for him could be in his physical development, because I think that unlocks more on the court.
Yeah, and that's certainly true. I 100% agree with that. And it's the sort of thing where I am willing to, even in my ignorance, trend optimistically and say, I think that's going to be fine. Is sort of, until proven otherwise, I think he's an 18-year-old kid, again, playing in a very physical league. Some of the
Yep.
same criticisms were there for Giddy, and Giddy is, he had his problems his rookie year, particularly from his shot, but I don't think he was lacking in aggressiveness. I don't think he
No,
ran into a rookie wall physically. I don't think there was any of that. So I
the
think that
best parts
Usmane,
of Giddy were able to translate in the NBA
yes,
immediately in his rookie season.
but there is in what you've laid out as a concern for him, there is something that also your colleague Maxwell hit on in a very good article about Usmane, which is about how physically he plays. I mean, it's one thing, and it's the whole Chet Holmgren thing, that he's rail thin, but he plays really hard, embraces physicality, seeks it
Yep.
out. And I think that Usmane, in the same way you said that you don't think he's necessarily a bad defender, I don't. I've seen worse in terms of guys avoid contact than him on
Oh
both
yeah.
sides of the ball. I've seen people more allergic to it, but there's no question that he prefers to avoid rather than finish through contact. And I think it's something that can be acquired in the NBA as you get older. It certainly can. But you always want to know, particularly in watching the playoffs, where you see where this intensity picks up. You want guys where that's not a calculation that they need to make, where they know that they're going to get hit and they're going to get hit hard, and they keep going. And it's sort of an old head kind of intangible coach speak way of doing it, but that doesn't make it any less correct. Like you need to be comfortable with the physicality of the game. Now, again, I'm willing to give Ousmane the benefit of the doubt because it is not easy. It really is not easy to play in that league physically in Australia. So I don't think it is anything really out of the ordinary. I think that, LaMelo Ball didn't like contact when he was there
Nope.
either. And he still has his own issues with contact. Now, he had a more special skill set, but as we've been saying, Ousmane has some special to him. And in one of the things I like most about him is that this is even unlike LaMelo and Giddy, is that though he has all these ball skills, I don't think he needs the ball no matter where he goes. I don't think taking him means you are building around him, because when
Oh, I
he
agree
is
with that 100%.
yeah, when he's stationed off the ball for this team, and his team is not good, and his team sort of has not played at home all year and has a lot of young players, he will get some possessions where he brings the ball up and runs pick and roll. There will be other possessions where he plays off of Peyton Siva of Louisville fame, and he's just sort of spotted up in the corner and he's just waiting to catch and shoot. And when he gets those opportunities, and it's either catch and shoot or attack a closeout or whatever, I think his decision making is good. I think his shot is good. I think it's, nice and quiet and the mechanics are repeatable. And I expect that he'll be able to do that at the next level as well. And that's the sort of thing where I wonder, okay, we agree that none of this stuff is really a barrier to him being a good player.
Yeah, it's
So,
honestly it's more nitpicking than anything really, which is I think also part of what I was trying to admit. Like Usmani has a foundation of a 6'10 shooter with ball skills that is the foundation of the majority of the biggest time stars in the NBA, certainly right now.
and like if you take Franz Wagner, who's a different prospect and a better prospect than Usmane was, but if you look at Franz, he I think there's every chance that he makes multiple All-Star games. I think that's very possible. I think on the team he's on, and I won't get into too much of a Magic tangent, there's going to be some tension about how much he's on the ball versus how much he's off because of the investments they've made at guard, which is
Yep.
not necessarily a bad thing. It, helps his versatility, but it also probably decreases the chance that he has some monster leap in his second or third year, because to do that, you need to have the ball in your hands all the time. So it might mean that he's not quite making all-star games at the rate of his peers in the 2021 class, but it still means he's an extremely valuable starter with a lot of upside, like in his early 20s. And that is very, very valuable. And that's sort of how I see the best version of Usmane playing out, is that he becomes a clearly positive starter early in his 20s, because you can't sort of keep this kind of skill off the court as long as he's shooting very well, with upside as he grows into his body to be more. We see it, and to bring up my pals, you see it with Brandon Ingram, how long it took him. And part of his issue was getting to a point physically where he could take the pounding that goes with being a 20 plus point per game scorer,
And it
efficiently.
unlocked everything else for him. That's actually a great player to use to get at my point in terms of his upward trajectory being even greater, or I won't say greater, but quicker, because he put in the time to work on his body to get to the point where he is now, which is one of the best scoring threats in the NBA.
Yeah. And that's again, we're talking about like the best case scenario outcomes
Correct.
for him, but so many guys don't have that on their roadmap. And
Exactly.
Usmani does. Now, I don't know much about his background or his intel. I That's sort of the last stuff I look at before the draft, because I really want to focus on the court game. But assuming all that stuff checks out, I just there's so many different opinions about this draft. There are people I think like you and I, who think it's very deep, like with wing bets, like bets
Yep.
to make that are very worthy bets to use a pick on. There are other people who think that there's like a steep drop after pick 7, and then you could go from 8 to 40 and make lots of similar cases. Both might be true to a degree, but if that's where you think that wherever your cutoff is, where below that you believe that you could make a bet on just about anyone. Well, if you're just making a bet, I don't know who a better bet is than this guy. I don't know who has a higher ceiling. I don't know who's shown more at a pro level. I don't know who is more physically unique. I don't know who can replicate his skill package. I just don't know what a better bet would be. And so it's not you have to make sure that your environment is going to be right for him and that you have a developmental plan,
Yep.
starting with the body, like you said, but also that he's going to come to a team where even if he's in the G League for a little while, that everything is on point and on schedule. You don't draft an 18-year-old kid and then put it on him to succeed. That's just not
Yep.
how the draft should work. But assuming that you have a plan, he's going to stick out. That's how rookies become rotation players. It's how rotation players become starters. It's oh man, those skills, they really give us an advantage. They are unique relative to other players in the league, and that's what I could see from him.
I I don't think this draft is going to be deep in the more traditional sense of the word. What I think I mean when I say deep is that I think there's going to be a lot of stakers in like the 10 to 25 range, and I think there's going to be some really smart NBA teams that recoup a lot of value outside of like that 25 range. So like 26 through like 45 or 50. I think there's going to be some real gold mined,
Mhm.
and that's what I see for this draft. I think the lottery is going to be I think the lottery is going to be fine. I think it's going to be a little bit better than people want to think or some people would sour on. I think the middle of the draft, I see a lot of swings that could be taken that don't pan out, but then I see some smart teams really getting into the thick of it and being able to make some really smart bets in like the late first, early second, all the way out to like the middle of the second, and then obviously middle of the second all the way to the end. I mean, it's a crapshoot, right? Like some guys just don't want to be on a non-guaranteed deal, so they don't get drafted, whatever the case may be. But I don't know how you see this draft before we move on to the next guy, Chuck. But that's really how I think it's going to pan out. Just deep
Well,
into
let's
different.
just well then if you think there's going to be a lot of stinkers 10 through 25, who are you referring to? Who are you talking about?
There, there are a number of guys who I'm
Oh, come
fond
on,
of, for
Nate.
example, but they are bets. Like, all right, for example, I know we didn't plan to talk about this guy, but your friend and mine, Bryce McGowan's, he's a risky pick. Whether
Your
you want to
friend
admit it
in
or
mine.
not, he's a risky pick
Uh-huh.
because he can be one of the rarest types of wings, a true three-level scorer. And I don't use that lightly. I think there's a lot of people who overuse three-level scorer. No, Bryce can actually be a three-level scorer, but
Right.
there are things he has to iron out about his offensive game, about his jump shot in particular. And then defensively, he's not the worst on the ball, but off the ball, he's a hot mess. And I saw it up close and personal to know that it's a little bit of a hot mess. So again, Bryce is somebody I'd like. He has a top 20 grade for me, but a team really has to know how they're going to develop him. Otherwise, I could see something like that, for example, not working out in a team's favor. And I do think he's going to be in that 10 to 25 range. I know a lot of people started mocking him in like the back end of the first round. They were starting to come back more around to him. Everything that I've heard and everything that I've been absorbing is that he's going to be in that late lottery all the way through to like the top 20 range. But like that's a risky proposition as an example.
I hear you. That's fair. I think that there's a version of Bryce that doesn't quite stick because the defense is always so terrible. But I would say again, I think Bryce is a little safer than that, only because I again put it to you. Bryce is 6'7", right? Six
Yep.
six, 6'7", right
He's
around
six
there.
six seven, 179 pounds, and that's probably 179 soaking wet.
Okay. Okay. All right. Let's not shame the poor kid. He's just a little skinny. He'll add
Now,
weight.
in his defense, though, one of the reasons why I did want to scout him up close was that I wanted to get a look at his body, and he has that broader build up top to the point where he is one of these guys who's going to add weight, and he's going to do it in a manner that won't affect him in any negative way. Like he is somebody who will definitely fill out.
Right. And so, what I'm saying is, guys like him at 6'7" who can create their own shot and get to the rim and
Yep.
draw fouls. Because
Yep.
he, unlike Ousmane, and this would be an argument for Bryce above him,
Yes.
he is very comfortable seeking contact and getting to the line. It's, in fact, the pillar of his offensive game is his ability to do that and knock down a ton of free throws. And I don't know in the last 10 years someone who got to the line that well at 6'7" off the dribble that didn't pan out because his off-ball defense wasn't very good. Maybe I'd have to go back and really look at it, but I to my mind, I cannot remember someone who did that well as a freshman that did not become a good NBA offensive player. And so I just think to myself, he's gonna find a way to do it. He'll find, and I'll just leave it at that because we hadn't planned on talking about him. But there are plenty of ways to wash out in the NBA. Like there certainly are. But the quickest way to do it is to lack ball skills and lack size. If you are just okay on the ball, but you're not very good on defense and you're 6'3", that's going to get tough for you. But if you're 6'7" and if you get to the line better than some, point guards do, then you're going to stick around. And I think Bryce is going to stick around.
Listen. I called him a risky bet. I do like him. I specifically titled my piece on him, betting on offense. Bryce McGowan's. I would absolutely bet on him and take a swing on him. You're talking to I feel like I'm the only guy at No Ceilings that likes Bryce McGowan's and I'm still in on Blake Wesley. I'm like the only guy. So yeah. I'm in rare company by myself on some of these guys.
But I like Blake Wesley. He's a bit more confusing to me than Bryce is.
But I don't love Blake Wesley. I've cooled on him to an extent. But I don't think he should be outside the first round. A lot of people are projecting him to be, unless you're one of these. I think there's high end reporters who are still projecting him around the lottery, the mid first range. I think he's good somewhere in 20 to 30. I just don't think you can let him leave the first round.
I agree with you. That is where I have him.
So let's shift gears to talk about a guard who is definitely not leaving the first round. Matter of fact, his stock has also roared up. I think Steven, we were talking about big boards on one of the Thunder podcasts that we were just on, Topic Thunder, and he's said that Malaki Branham is 8th on his big board right now. Mm-hmm. I think Branham's a safe lottery talent for me as well. But you wanted to talk about Malaki Branham, and I've been singing this guy's praises on multiple fronts. I was just on a few Knicks podcasts even where I said Branham would be a dynamite fit for the New York Knicks if they stayed in that 11 spot. I think Branham could fit a lot of places. And my argument for Branham, I don't know if you'll have a similar argument for him or what direction you're going to go in his evaluation, but he's one of these guys, not that he's the same one-to-one comp as this guy, but I was thinking about this today. In the same way that not a lot of people valued just how lethal Desmond Bane could be offensively for Memphis. And it's not that he's this quote unquote amazing star guy, but I don't know how many defenses wanted to come in and game plan around Desmond Bane this early on in his career. But if you don't at least account for Desmond Bane, he will torch you. And he's done that particularly all of this year. I see Branham in the same way. Branham might not come in and be your second or third option on offense, but if he's your fourth guy and teams come in and they're building their scheme around you defensively, and they're not at least accounting for and respecting Malaki, he is one of these guys that even in an NBA system could burn you for 20 or 30 points on any given night. And I don't know how I can say that about that many other guards in this draft. That's why I think he's really special. He has developing on-ball skills, but even if that's not the route that you want to develop him and you see him as more of this off-ball spot up type of guy, like even in what he does right now, he can be incredibly lethal. And he was, particularly in the second half of the year for Ohio State. And I could see him thriving in the exact same way in the NBA. So that's why I've become really high on him. But why are you really high on him, Chuck?
For much the same reason. And I wanted to talk about Malaki. I'm glad that you're as high on him as you are, and I'm glad that Steven is as high on him as he is.
Listen, you and I think we might think we come into podcasts and we might have a lot of disagreements with one another. I think you and I really do see the game in a lot of the very same respects. I think there are just some points where you and I prioritize different things in the draft, but I think we see the game really the same, which is why I think our conversations are so successful on podcasts.
Well, thanks, man, and good for us. Look at us.
Look at us. Exactly. It's that Paul and me. Look at us.
That is the name of the game, is really everyone can come to roughly a consensus over a scouting report, but what you value is where the differences really are.
Yep.
And with Malaki, there is part of me that wants to put him like 6th in the draft. Part of me. And my pitch on that is that his scoring that really picked up in the second half of the year when Ohio State really leaned into it was so consistent for him. Like he was a high volume, he wasn't a high volume 3-point shooter, but he was a high volume shooter. He and EJ were the two guys that they ran their stuff through. But as far as pick and roll goes, like Malaki was the guy by the end of the year at Ohio State. And he's an 18-year-old kid. He's turning 19, I think, next month. And for 18-year-olds, like this is a big thing with me in the draft. It is one thing to be a freshman. Most prospect freshmen are 19. For an 18-year-old to produce, it really augurs well for their NBA success. And Malaki, his touch was so good everywhere, and he started churning out these 20-point games the second half of the year. That I think I said this with Matt Penny when he was on my podcast. If the season had gone another month or two, and it was May Madness instead of March Madness, he would have had 10 more 20-point games. It seemed like I'm going to get a step on you, not a nuclear first step, but not bad. And as soon as my shoulders are square by you, I can rise up and hit this jumper like it's nothing. And it's interesting because, again, it's not the type of guard that you expect to see go really high in the draft. You usually like to see either someone with Tyrese Halliburton's vision where they can sling all these passes and manipulate weak side defenders. That's really sort of the draft Twitter, chum in the water that we like to eat up so much, is the vision that a guard can have in running pick and roll. Yep. You want to see hyper athleticism, what Ja has or what Anthony Edwards has, where they stick out so radically for their power and their burst and the pressure they put on the rim. Malaki is different. He is in neither category. All he does is hit shots off the dribble, off the catch, mid-range, at the rim, from three. This is an 18-year-old kid who shot 70% at the rim. 70 as a 6'5" guard in a major conference. Tyrese Maxey, for your Sixers, who's the toast of the town, deservedly so in Philadelphia right now, and who is known as a finisher in college, that was his signature offensive skill, was his finishing package. was 65% at the rim. Now, it was on a lot higher volume. I think Maxey is a better finishing prospect than Branham was. But it speaks to sort of what he was able to do in the second half of the year with this metronomic consistency. He was putting up efficiency at the rim that was reminiscent of, solid big men, and he was hitting his threes at over 40%. I don't even see him mentioned that frequently as quite possibly, the best shooter in the draft. I think Jabari deservedly gets that title. I think AJ Griffin gets some shine there. But Malaki, he should be right there. And it's a little different because he pushes his shot out a little more. He doesn't create a ton of space. And I don't think those concerns should be dismissed.
He doesn't create a ton of space, but he gets really good elevation on his jump shot, which makes up for it.
And it's just the sort of thing where, again, it's scarcity. There are not guys historically who finish who shoot as well from every area of the floor as Malaki shoots. And he's 6'5". He has a nice long wingspan. He's well built. He's not going to be a defensive liability, I don't believe. And he'll be able, because of his shooting, to play off the ball. So as long as he buys in, by the time that kid is 25 and his good frame is already filled out, we know we don't have to necessarily project a skinny prospect to become like a built prospect because he's already on his way. Then it is very hard for me to imagine how he wouldn't have a place on a playoff team, how he wouldn't reliably contribute to a playoff team. Because if this kid is not the number one option on your team, if he's the third or fourth option and he's getting favorable defensive matchups and he's getting the ball with the defense already scrambled, then he's gonna make his stuff.
He's gonna cook. He's gonna absolutely live off of that shit, and for good reason.
And as far as the vision and the passing goes, which isn't terrible, but it's not, not great, not his strength. I am firmly in the camp that stuff becomes easier in the NBA. That is something that, being surrounded by talent and having more space, that is one of the areas where it manifests the most, that you can become a very solid passer, if not a great one, then a good one that keeps the machine going. And then the question is just, well, okay, if this kid is going to be a playoff guard and you're going to be able to play him relatively early because the shot is there, how much do you value that relative to your board? And when I say I would put him roughly sixth, I mean, how many guys do you think have realistic chances of being multi-time All-Stars in the draft? If the answer is 4, well, then I think Malaki should be getting your attention at number 5. Maybe it's not the guy you list there, but he shouldn't be far away. Because if once that upside is gone, once you think that, all right, the studs who are going to be the first or second best player on a really good team, once those guys are listed on your board, then Malaki has every argument. I'll put it that way. He has every argument to be included right there at that level. He doesn't remind me of any player. Like, I could see some Malcolm Brogdon in him a little bit.
Yep.
But because the way he scores is a little atypical for top picks, I have him more towards the back of the lotto. But I could move him up to, like I said, 6, 7, 8. I think he absolutely deserves consideration there.
I'm in the same boat. And just to sort of put the bow on everything that we wanted to talk about with Malaki, and tying it back to the lens that you and I like to look through when we evaluate these prospects, is through the playoffs and what's working in the playoffs. What do you need to win in the playoffs? What are the playoffs about? Half court offensive execution. Right. Chuck, as a young freshman, the kid was in the 88th percentile in overall half-court offense, shot almost 50% in overall half-court offense. That accounts for everything. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. Pick a percentile that you want to look up for Malaki's offense, and I can tell you it's probably going to be at least average. The majority that you would want to look at, the majority of the play types he was involved in at volume are very good to excellent. His game might not be the sexiest, as you talked about. He's not one of those incredible, I'm going to jump and finish over you athletes, but that's not always what you're looking for. If you can get a weapon like Malaki Branham in the lottery, I think you're hanging up that phone and you're doing a whole bunch of fist pumps because you are excited about the player that you get to bring in. That's where I'm at on him. And by the way, anybody out there who does want to read a little bit more about not just Malaki Branham's scoring versatility, but also some of his passing that he brings, particularly out of the pick and roll game, go read Tyler Metcalf's piece on NoCeilingsNBA.com about Malaki Branham's passing. He did a really good job with that one. I agree it's not one of his top shelf strengths, but the makings of him being a playmaker out of pick and roll are already there. And I do agree with your point, Chuck, that surrounded by better talent, some of that stuff, if it's already there, it's only going to get better in the NBA in most regards. So he is an offensive dynamo. I'm in the same camp as you about having him like late lottery right now, but I could absolutely move him up my board in the same way that I'm probably going to move Ousmane on my board as well. Like Ousmane was a top 20 guy for me for a good portion of the year until like towards the end of that first half run. And I finally just gave up on having him in my top 30 because I just didn't know if he was honestly going to be in the draft. Like I really didn't know what was going to happen for him. Now he came back in the second half. I'm like, all right, I can put this guy and move him back to where I originally had him or slightly above that. Malachi's come out of nowhere this year, and I think even as you said, Matt Penny has even said the same thing, and same as Sam Vecini. He's come out of nowhere, and I don't know where I'm going to end with him on my board either. He is such a safe case to make, and yes, if you're in the lottery, you should try to star hunt for as long as possible, but would you rather try and swing for the fences on somebody you are not nearly as confident about? Or would you rather take a guy like Malaki Branham, who you know is going to be a pro for a really long time, and as you said, has the chance to play playoff minutes very early on in his career, meaningful playoff minutes. So I think I'm in the same boat as you.
Well, and what you mentioned about the safeness of the pick versus star hunting, like a this again is not reinventing the wheel, but the advantage in the NBA is already knowing who your stars are. When that's like, duh, you want to have stars are better than not having stars, which of course it is. But one of the main benefits is that it allows you to not trip over yourselves in the draft. And if you know Malachi Branham is going to be good, like this is the thing with the Pelicans right now, and I'm sorry, I just have them on the brain, so I'm going to reference them as much as I can.
By all means, talk about the dart friendly Pels because I've enjoyed watching them in this playoff run too.
The reason they are able to have so much success with their rookies, apart from the rookies themselves just making good picks, is that they knew they had an offensive structure in place, and more than half of their offensive structure hasn't played this year in Zion. But in Zion and Ingram, they go, okay, we have that, and we can just fill in around them. It is much harder if, I'm trying to think of a team that, whose offensive structure is a little unsettled. But, maybe the Magic, again, is another good example of not really knowing who they're going to rely on for offense night in and night out. That still means that they are tempted to swing and swing and swing for the fence. And that's good. And maybe they connect and it's all hunky dory. But it does mean that they tend to pass up on guys who are just going to be very, very good NBA players. And getting good starters is not easy in the NBA.
Nope.
It is costly. And teams know it. And teams tend to retain those guys. Like, you just look at the contract structure and how there are guys on rookie contracts are eligible for extensions after year 3. it's not just stars who get extended after year 3. The vast
Correct.
majority of any player that's shown any proficiency at all towards winning gets extended. They get snapped up. So the sooner or the more frequently that you can find guys who can contribute to winning and who can fit around star talent, the more you should pick them. And that's what Malaki is.
So we've agreed, very much so, all the way through till now on this podcast. But
Yeah.
I will save one Jake LaRavia for the very end.
Okay.
We will talk about Jabari Walker out of Colorado. And
Mhm.
what was really funny was you put out a tweet that I saw on social media that you said specifically there are not 60 guys in this draft class better than Jabari Walker. And Steven and I were literally talking to each other when we read that tweet. And Steven's like, no, but according to my board, there might be 57 or 58. And we got a good chuckle out of that one. But I really thought that having Jabari Walker and Julian Champagny, and not that we're going to talk about Julian, but having both of those guys as kind of like a package duo at the back end of the second, I didn't think that was going to be as popular of an opinion as it's been. Yet that's really where I see the majority of people mock or list them on their big boards is like this back end of the second round grade. And I want you, Chuck, just as I had you on before to try and sell me on Tari Eason, I want you to sell me on Jabari Walker because I want to have him higher on my board. I'm a little confused with how he fits positionally in the NBA. I get this feeling that he might be one of these tweeners in a bad way. And maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I'm thinking about that a little too hard, and that's why I'm more down on him than I should be. But why don't you give me your pitch, Chuck, about why Jabari Walker is one of your guys, and more so why you just think he's being undervalued at this point in the process?
Okay. Okay. So first to the for those who don't know, Jabari Walker is a 19-year-old sophomore, another guy who's
Yep.
young for his grade, and he is 6'9", nice long wingspan, probably 7'1" in that neighborhood. Um, and in 2 years at Colorado, because he was there as an 18-year-old freshman, he has shot 40% from three, basically 40% on the dot, and he has shot 78% from the line. His game is where he pops the most for draft purposes is that catch and shoot threes. He is very good, can be very good, and he really started heating up towards the end of the season for Colorado. And he rebounds the crap out of the ball.
Yes, he
One
does.
of the best rebounders for his age in the country. Really, really, really good. And I think there is a traditional notion in draft circles that you shouldn't count on rebounding to like carry a prospect. And I think that that is fair. You shouldn't count on rebounding to carry a prospect. But what it shows me with regards to Jabari, this goes back to what we were talking about Ousmane, is that he will be very comfortable with the physicality of the game in the NBA. Because if he is winning physical battles, which is what rebounding is, particularly in college where everything's cramped and where teams more frequently go for offensive rebounds, if he is winning physical battles over and over as a puppy who came into college as a three-star recruit and was a little raw. And I think that's another reason he's lower on boards is because he didn't have the pedigree, despite being, the son of an longtime NBA player. Then he is going to win physical battles in the NBA. And I think that the real question on him that a lot of people have is he a good enough athlete to reliably stick in the league? And to me, I think he is. Now, maybe I'm a little optimistic on that about his lateral mobility and things like that, but you have to remember, 3-star recruit, that means that he's not playing in all the major tournaments necessarily, and he came to Colorado, and it's not necessarily a blue blood program, and I don't know that he has gotten sort of the physical development and work that lots of power schools give to their prospects, where they come into the draft really looking like finished products.
Is an optimistic outcome for him, and I don't think this should be taken in a negative context. I would consider this positive, and it would help me move Jabari up my board. Is an optimistic outcome for him like a Daniel House type outcome?
I don't think Daniel House, no. I see where you're going with it, but House, first of all, I think is more like 6'6", 6'7" kind of range. And I think he is probably a bit more explosive than
Yep.
Jabari. I see Jabari more as more or less a power forward who can moonlight a little bit at 5. I don't think you'd want to like do that too much with him.
I think
But
teams are absolutely going to experiment with him at the 5 because like a lot of his value can be as a post up threat and or like a roll man. And I still think there's more to be unlocked with his game in terms of operating off of the short roll and being a little bit of a playmaker out of the short roll in terms of a passer. Like I
I
think teams
agree.
are going to experiment in that way.
I agree. I think he is a player that he kind of reminds me of a little bit. Oh, well, I don't know. Maybe not. I I see him as an optimistic outcome is that he is a 5th starter on an NBA team. I'll
Yes.
put it that way without going too deep into the positions, because if we're going to be positionless, then let's be positionless. He does not, I don't think he gets played off the court because he's going to be so hopeless in space. I think that they're, like I said, about his body. I think, by the way, like he dunks the ball, pardon me, dunks the ball all the time. It's not as though he, like I said, where he doesn't win physical battles. It's more about how well can he move his hips and shift his hips and keep guys in front of him and stuff like that. I believe that with the right regimen to increase his flexibility and open him up, I think he's going to be good enough at doing that. And once you get there, you're going to have a guy who's on the right side of the age curve who can already shoot. And if you look at the kid in Denver, Zeke Naji, you know him, who's like
Yes.
low key a really good 3-point shooter,
I
and
fought for Zeke in the draft, and he kind of came in a little bit not as great as I wanted him to be in his rookie year, but now he's started to come on more for Denver.
yeah, a little bit. And I think that his problem is that Denver's really trying. They're trying to contend as much as they possibly can, and so they are peppering as much like veteran talent who's not going to screw up around
Yep.
Jokic as possible. But that's a kid who can shoot and who can rebound and who can slide laterally. And it's not, that doesn't get you all the way there, because you do need to be able to put the ball on the floor and attack a closeout. Um, but I just think I just think it's on the table for him. And I think that Jabari, I don't know, maybe this is a Zeke Naji kind of thing where he's too rigid, too rigid in what he does. And
That's really been the argument against Jabari Walker is that
so
he's a
make the
little too
argument.
stiff.
You make the argument. So stiff how. I
He's
like punching back. So tell me how he's stiff, and I'll see if I can push back a little bit.
he's too upright. Like I don't think he's coordinated enough with his dribble to do much of anything off the bounce at the NBA level. And that I think that sticks to part of the projection. So like if the ball let's talk about it. So playoffs, right? If
Hmm.
Jabari Walker gets to a point in his career where he's playing playoff minutes, the ball's swung around to him. He
Hmm.
has to be able to either shoot at a high enough level immediately off the catch, or he has to be able to attack a closeout and do something with the ball, and he has to be coordinated enough off the bounce to not just fumble and turn it over. I don't
Hmm.
have the answer to the second part of that equation. I truthfully, honestly don't. which is why I don't know if his future is as a guy who you're just telling him to go out to the corner to space the floor for everybody else. Is his best opportunity in more limited minutes as like a small ball five who can offer you more versatility as like a roll man or a pick and pop guy, and that's how he's used on the court. That's where I think it comes into play. I don't think it's as big of a deal as some would make it out to be, but those are my concerns related to that.
Okay, and those are valid concerns. I totally get it. And if that's the reason, then that's your reason. And it's not, I don't know if it's the best, like, I don't know if it's the best podcast segment, just be like, well, I disagree. But
No,
I,
we can come on, we can agree to disagree. We're gentlemen here.
no, it's not that. It's just that I want to be able to, if that's the conclusion, I want to be able to provide more reasoning other than to say, like, well, I think he can. I want to be able to put more meat on the bone. I, and I think that where I come down on it is that I don't like to put guys into boxes when they're 19. If he were
Correct.
a junior and he were 21, and I think Julian is turning 21 this summer, but he's been at St. John's all 3 years. This was supposed to be his big year where he really addressed his limitations and he kind of came back as the same guy frequently. Although I think he has a chance in the NBA, but he kind of came back as the same player. Um, Jabari's just still young enough that I think he's going to be fine. And I think that his passing got better this year. I think he was so raw last year. He really was. That he's was clearly by the end of the season, in my opinion, the best player on that team. I mean, they played Arizona in the Pac-12 semifinals in that conference tournament back when Arizona was really rolling and on their way to the number one overall seed in that tournament, and hit 6 threes in the first half against a team with a ton of size
And this
and
all
a
comes back
ton
to
of
offense, by the way.
versatility.
Like I have very little bad to say about Jabari Walker defensively. I don't think he's somebody who you want switching out on the guards all the time and being in a very switchable defense. But in terms of like positionally, he's probably going to be more of a 4-3 than a 3-4. But like anything like 3 through 5, like in small ball situations, like I fully trust him defensively. So I have very little bad to say about him on that. And more of my questions
Okay.
are offensive.
Okay. So you do. Okay. So you trust him defensively. You do. So let me give you this. This is the comp I was holding back because he doesn't
In
quite.
not a hyper switchable scheme, yes.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Here's a name that I was thinking about that I don't think is the best comp for him, but I think it is an interesting comp to throw out. What would you say about like Maxi Kleber for him? Also, not the most skilled guy with the ball in his hands. Moonlights between 4 and 5. Frequently plays bigger than he is. Very good rebounder. Maxi's a great shot blocker, but another guy who is not, he's not really a wing, but he can stay in front of wings, and he's a good shooter, or he can be a very good shooter. So, what do you think about someone like that?
I do like that comp. And I think that's more of the role that I would want Jabari Walker to play. Like if I'm giving him minutes in a rotation that's like 8 or 9 players deep, that's the type of role that I would want him to thrive in. And so the question is, how high do you draft that player? And that's actually a fantastic question to ponder over. How high do you draft that player, Chuck?
To me, I have him like early 20s, right around 20. There's just that's where there's a glut to me. And look, you could make a case for someone ranked 50th for the 20s, like you can in this draft.
That
I
is
don't know,
also
just
correct.
that Christian Brown might be 20 for some people and Jabari Walker might be 50. Like I get it. That's fair. When you look back to what the draft really produces here, Jabari at his age and at his size, physicality and shooting, that's a bet I'm very comfortable making. Now, the guys who are around him, I have Kendall Brown and Marjan Beauchamp in similar like in that same area. I can see an argument very easily that both those guys have higher ceilings than Jabari and are probably worthier bets to make. And I think that's fine. But again, being a fifth starter on a good team is just a lot more valuable than people give it credit for. It is harder to find. You have to, unless someone falls into your lap, like for example, to keep it on the Mavericks where Maxi plays, they signed Reggie Bullock for the mid-level this past year. And Reggie Bullock is like indispensable to their team now. Without Reggie Bullock, they're not up 3-2 on the Jazz. They're not 4 seed. Like they need him badly. And there aren't just Reggie Bullocks just hanging out at pick 20 in every draft. It's just not how it works. You have to understand the value of guys who can make shots and hang on defensively and guard more than one position. And that's another guy who's off the dribble game and he's shorter. He's more of a guard than he is a wing or a big wing. He's another guy who off the dribble doesn't do a ton for you. But Jabari is going to be unselfish. He's going to relish defensive matchups. He's going to battle and win his share. And if there's another difference between him and Julian Champagny, I would say it is comfort with physicality is one notable difference.
That we could agree on.
Jabari, again, they played Arizona 3 times, and he battled with Koloko all throughout all of those games on offense and defense, and had a play in that game, that semifinal, where he had a fake DHO spun, beat Koloko, who's lauded for his switchability, and drew a foul at the rim on him. Like I just think that though he's upright right now, I think that is something that can be addressed. There are some guys who have high hips you know, who never quite get out of that, but it's usually coupled with a lack of explosion. But if you show real athletic juice in some area, I am at least a believer that the other areas can start to catch up. And that's what I'm hoping with him. I admit that this is more of a stretch and pun intended, but I think that he's got something. I really
You're helping me. You Urson Demir, who I've had on the podcast, mutual friend CJ Marchesani, you guys are all helping me move him up my board and ease some of my concerns. But I appreciate that you and I can see a similar role / outcome at his best. Like, I actually haven't talked to many people who want to entertain like the small ball 5 type of stuff and see him as more of like a 4 or 5, which you might think is surprising. I don't see how that isn't part of the high end outcome for him.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the thing with small ball 5 is that's another one that is tough in draft circles. It's hard, like I just think it's hard to be a small ball 5.
It
I think you
is.
have
It's
to
not
be
easy.
real. You have to be really switchable, and you have to, it. There's just a. It's a. I think sometimes it can be used as a. Well, if this doesn't work, well, he'll just be able to play small ball 5, where that's not really the case. Small ball 5 is usually a luxury, not a last resort for a prospect. So could Jabari do it? I don't know. I mean, he's 6'8", 200 pounds. I would think that he would need to put on some weight.
He's
I
gonna
think it'd be
he's gonna put on weight. That boy's gonna keep filling out. That I absolutely
tough.
buy into. He has
And to
really
that
good
point,
frame.
mentioning that he wins physical battles, his 78% free throw came on 160 attempts, which is a nice healthy number. He was getting to the line, and it's not as though he was playing exclusively out of the post. He was lined up on the wing a lot. And with that wingspan, it's you can get calls if you're physical enough and if you want it, and he wants it.
Oh, damn it, Chuck. You're winning me over. You did it again, man. Congratulations to you. You're
It's
really
just
winning
a
me over.
case. These are all bets. They're bets at this point. I'm
No,
not.
they're darts. They're not bats.
That's
They're
right.
darts.
That's right. Even I'm like a little tentative with these darts. This draft, man, is like the way I think of it is there are so many bets that I think are worth making that this is a draft of like 25 like 13th overall picks. That's sort of how I see it. And I think that makes it a good and very interesting draft. I don't think it makes it terrible the way that some people think, but maybe I'm wrong.
It is
Maybe I'm wrong.
not. You're right. It is not a terrible draft. I think it's going to be good, just in as I said earlier, in different ways than we're expecting. I'll put it that way. So
Mhm.
our last dart that we're going to talk about is this conversation couldn't have been any better time, because by the time everyone's listening to this podcast, Corey Tulliver will have already put out a piece on No Ceilings. He recently took a trip to Toms River, New Jersey, and he saw and interviewed both Jake LaRavia as well as Kevin McCullough in a pre-draft workout setting. So he got a very nice up close and personal look at Mr. LaRavia. And what's interesting about Jake, Chuck, is there's a lot of off-ball offense that can be highlighted from a cutting standpoint or a transition standpoint. But I specifically asked Corey, I'm like, what kind of drills is Jake running? Like, what are some of the things that they're really focusing on in workouts for him? And he said a lot of spot up shooting, and even more so, a lot of movement shooting. And I'm like, if this dude is as legit of a shooter as some of the numbers have indicated, in which on lower volume at Indiana State, his first year, he was 40.7%, but only on less than 1 3-point attempt per game. But last year at Wake Forest, 2.2 3-point attempts per game, 38.4%. And he's been a pretty decent free throw shooter for the majority of his college career. Like, if that's the type of shooter that we can expect to see in the NBA, on top of everything he brings to the table from a connector standpoint, offensively, from a defensive standpoint, listed at 6'9", about 228, 230 pounds. Like, yeah, I think this guy has to go in the first round. And I've kind of had him in like this top 40 range for a while, but I know Steven just moved him into the top 30 of his board. I think Corey's certainly going to be there after seeing him. He said absolutely without a doubt a first round pick after seeing some of the shooting stuff up close. This is a guy who has gained steam, not like in mainstream circles, but in like more niche circles on draft Twitter. That's the word.
More darty circles. I like the
Yes.
idea that there's like a mainstream draft Twitter. I know what you mean when you say that, but y'all are like a dominant collective. I think if anyone's the mainstream, y'all are about as close as we've got to it. But that's me.
Well, I appreciate that compliment, but the point of it is that LaRavia is picking up steam, and he was a guy who I think was not on a lot of people's radars for the majority of the college year. Everyone, myself included, was very fascinated with Alondas Williams, and I still am. But LaRavia is a very, very interesting prospect to talk about. And as I said, if the shooting can tie things together, you have a very high floor NBA prospect, which are words that I didn't expect to utter about Jake LaRavia about a month and a half ago. But I want you to make more of the case for him, Chuck. Why is he one of your guys?
So I appeared on the Draft Dummies, or it was the Locked On NBA Draft show, hosted by Sam Ferris at Draft Dummies. A few months ago, I think probably around January, that time frame, and he wanted me to give one underrated and one overrated prospect. My underrated guy was LaRavia, and I compared the draft perception of him to the draft perception of Harrison Ingram. Harrison Ingram has a lot of fans, had and has a lot of fans.
He does not have a fan in me. I apologize, Harrison Ingram. He does not have a fan in me. But
well, so here's the point: is that he is a big wing. He has some ball skills. He has a lot of good feel for the game. He's young. He's pretty clearly a winning college player. Like he knows how to play, and he knows where to be. He knows where rotations are going to be on both sides of the ball, and how to make good passes, and he can score out of the post. But athletically, a little challenged, a little slow in space.
I trust nothing that he does from a scoring standpoint outside of 3 feet from the basket.
And that's the difference. Is I was like, look, LaRavia at the time he was shooting 67% on twos. And I think he came down to about 61, 62 to finish the year. And this is on high volume because he was Wake Forest's second highest usage player behind Alondas. So he's shooting 62% on twos. He shot, I believe, 37% on threes or right around there. And he shot over 75% from the line. His touch was incredible all year. And so the theory goes, why is Ingram thought of highly as a first rounder at the time? And why is LaRavia not on draft boards? Because they're both 6'8", 6'9", around 230. And that has switched. And I think maybe not most, but there's probably an even split about who is preferred as a prospect at this time. And I think that LaRavia is staying in the draft, and I don't know that Ingram is. And that probably tells you what kind of feedback they're getting. But all of his value, not all, but a great portion of his value comes from his offensive game, and particularly his touch. So North Carolina goes on this run and makes a national title game, and that's a game they probably should have won. There's between the concussion and the floorboard and the puke, just lots of weird things happen in the second half of that game. But they were every bit like right there to win the national title.
Yep.
And one of the reasons they were in that game is that both in the ACC, not the ACC tournament, both in Coach K's last game and in the Final Four against Duke, they did a pretty good job containing Paolo Banchero. And one of the reasons they did a good job containing Paolo Banchero is that Brady Manick was able to hold up in the post. And that's where Paolo really liked to go to work, was in the post. LaRavia played, this is, I think Wake Forest's probably best win of the year because they beat UNC by like 20 in January at home. And LaRavia went at Manick, same guy who stopped Paolo Banchero, and ate him alive. Scored 31 points on 13 shots. 13 for 31. And when he gets into the lane, when he gets 2 feet into the paint, as draft folks like to say, if he can shoot over his left shoulder and shoot with his right hand, the ball's just going to go in if he gets a clean look at it. And he's comfortable going off the window. I think personally his three is I just think it's good. I think it's good now. I don't have any real issue about it. It was a low volume shot just because he had never really been asked to fully lean into it. And he's so good at cutting that he finds himself in 2-point territory a lot. And if you have touch like that, you might as well use it. But I think his 3-pointer looks good. I think he can, when he gets hot, it's a swish after swish, very smooth kind of three. And I just think it's going to be there for him. The question with him comes on defense. Now, his steal and block rates, I think, are solid and have been solid. This is a guy who played 1 year of high major basketball. He played 2 years at Indiana State. Again, young for his grade. He is a 20-year-old junior and is not turning 21 until, I think, November. So he will be 20 on draft night. The question you have to ask is, at 6'8", he is likely going to be a power forward, because though his timing's really good, he makes up for some slow feet and some slow hips, in part from his timing and in reading the game and in positioning himself. He is likely to not be that versatile on defense. Now, maybe, again, in a post-up situation or in a one-on-one sort of ball-stopping situation, he can hang in. But in terms of being part of a scramble and recover defense, he can get blown by. So the dual questions are, number one, can that improve? Again, going from Indiana State to Wake Forest, it doesn't mean you have necessarily the strength programs that other D1 schools have. So
I think it can improve. So that would be my answer to the first question.
So that's one, is do you think it can improve? And number two, if it can't, but he's still this really efficient offensive player, how valuable is that guy in the NBA? When I first noticed LaRavia, which was back in November, I think I sent a tweet out about him, and I just threw off the cuff. I compared him to Joe Ingles, and Ingles, um, I think it is a better defender, like obviously a better defender
Yes.
than LaRavia, and had a very good defensive career, very underrated defensive career, and had very quick hips. But his value, the reason he was able to stick in the league was because of his jumper and because he was just an extremely efficient player. I think if you take Joe Ingles' career and you say this, you're going to be a part of a key cog to multiple playoff teams where you can start some and you can rest some, and you are going to be good enough to be sixth man of the year at least once. Like again, in just about any draft, that career outcome puts you in the top 10 or 12 of players in that class. That's usually what it means. There's not 10 or 12 outcomes better than that. I don't know if LaRavia is going to get there, but he has the touch and the shooting to at least keep himself around to see where else his game takes him, to see how much better a defense he can get. And he's the type of guy who's very self-aware. He's going to know what he needs to work on because he sees the game so well.
Yep.
That plays out of how good a passer he is and what a valuable connector he was for that Wake team. They did well when he was on the court, and even with Alondas, kind of they tended to fall apart with him off the court unless Alondas was really cooking. And those are the type of guys that, again, can play around better talent. My concern with him is one of the concerns you have with Jabari, which is I don't think his handle is very good, and I think it is susceptible against good defenders and sort of any NBA defender. I think it is susceptible against.
And that's the main part where like the Ingles comp would fall off, in my opinion. I think they're
Oh,
they're they're very similar in a lot of aspects, but I think that would be the one place where it falls off.
yeah, and I think that's fair. And the other part of it is that even if he improves physically a little bit, if he's a four, then yes, maybe he can survive on defense against some like weak wings, but the players that are really really good in the NBA are usually their most weaponized when they're playing power forward. That's Tatum, Doncic, Giannis. I guess Giannis is more five when he's most weaponized, but lots of guys tend to be that because same thing we talked about at the top with last year's draft. You're looking for big guys with real guard skills. So if that's who you got, and that's who LaRavia all of a sudden sort of has to guard because he can't really guard other positions, well, then you're in trouble. And then you have to ask yourself the question, how good an offensive player does he have to be to where a team goes, we're going to hide him on a bad offensive player on defense, but he can stay on the floor for us because of how good he is offensively. That's sort of the ratio. I think that a popular player mold going forward to look for, and I think that one that a couple guys in this draft have an argument as a comp for, is Grant Williams, another extremely efficient offensive player in college. But Grant, I think, gets knocked a little bit for his movement skills on defense, which are better than you think.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, I mean, he was a two-time SEC Defensive Player of the Year, or pardon me, SEC Player of the Year, and part of that was his defense. And you can see him like survive against Kevin Durant on certain possessions. Not everyone, obviously, but but he's very good, and he uses his strength and he weaponizes it, and he contributes to this defense that's blitzing through the playoffs right now. And that's where, if LaRavia were a little better on defense and a little more athletic and a little more disruptive, that's a role I think I could see him in. I think he's that talented on offense with his shooting and his passing. But that's the question, is whether he can bridge that gap. So you said you think he can get more athletic. What is giving you that that assurance, that confidence?
No, I thought he could get better in multiple aspects on defense, not necessarily saying more athletic. I
Okay.
didn't think that that was what I agreed to, but
Oh, that's okay.
my
I'm sorry, man. Yeah, I was rambling anyway, so I apologize. But
no,
yeah,
it's all good.
that's the question is if he it's the sort of it's I don't know if it's high ceiling, low floor, but like if he can if he can bridge that a little bit and be a little better on rotations, he's smart enough and he's big enough that I think he can turn into a fifth starter and be good. But if he can't and he just has this offensive juice, yes, he'll stick around, but I don't know how much he contributes to really good teams other than maybe being a rotation guy on like a first round playoff team, which is still really good, but it's
Yep.
not what you're hoping to take a swing on in the draft, you know?
I think I think he's got. I trust the intel on the shooting. I think he's going to have enough shooting. We already talked about his off ball value as a cutter, as a mover. I think the biggest thing that it comes down to for me with LaRavia is, will he be a low mistake player in the right situations? When you ask him to do a little too much, that's when he's had his higher turnover games at Wake Forest, and vice versa. Some of the stuff you pointed out on the defensive end, when he is late on some of those rotations, when he is late on closing the gaps, it's when he gets himself in a little bit of foul trouble as well.
Right.
So I think both of those things, I think of it as long as a team knows what they have in him offensively and they don't ask him to do too much. And in turn, I think if he makes improvements on the defensive end to just improve some of that reaction time to get better at seeing things before they happen. And to me, with a lot of the other things that he brings value to, I think he is a really smart player, which is why I think he's going to improve in some of those aspects. I think the low mistake portion of it on both ends of the floor is really to me what it comes back to, because I think he can do enough else offensively on the court and he isn't as negative on the defensive end to where like I can see him getting minutes and playing a valuable role in a playoff series for a team down the line, which is what we wanted to tie all of this back to. Do you agree with me about like the low mistake point?
I do, but I think there are different types of high mistake players. And I think Laravia is the type I would rather not have. One type of high mistake player is you have a lot of physical talent, but you haven't figured out sort of the decision making part of the game yet. And so
You're a little too creative.
oh, may I mean, you could, I guess you could use Alondas Williams' teammate as a comp for this, but like
Yes.
you haven't figured out what passes to make in what situations. You're over aggressive and you need to sort of rein it in and figure out what is efficient, what isn't. At one extreme end of the spectrum on this type of player, it's like Anthony Edwards,
Yep.
or at least Anthony Edwards, the prospect. The other type of high mistake player are guys that have really good processing, who do know the right decisions, but their physical ability doesn't allow them to make those decisions all of the time. And that's more what I think is the case with Arabia.
That
Right?
is exactly. So he has to really make up for it in terms of his processing speed and how to read the floor to better position himself to not make some of those mistakes, which is with that's hard to do. The mental aspect of the game is harder in some respects to harder than I think people think to improve upon, because the game just moves so fast at the NBA level. And if he's already making some of those mistakes at the college level, it is a little bit of a jump to ask him to make improvements in a much faster and more athletic league that is the NBA. I would agree with you on that point.
Well, and it's like, look at, go all the way down the spectrum. You're a very smart guy and you study a lot of film. So on an NBA court, you would know what the right decision is to make a lot of the time if the ball came to you. You would know where the percentages is in your favor, and you would know your teammates' skills, and you would know who should have the ball next once it comes to you or whether you should shoot. But the physical limitations are going to come back on you. They'd come back on me
Yep.
too. And so that's how guys get out of the league. That's how guys don't quite make it. Is if there isn't a place for them in a game as fast as the NBA. And that's the concern with LaRavia. Now, he has the
Yep.
size, he has all this shooting and all this skill.
Yep.
So I think first
He's a
round, I
better
think,
bet to make, but he's not a sure thing, which I would agree with.
yeah, I think there's a real chance that he does not hit that he doesn't. And I think that his ceiling is, like I said, like rotation guy on a playoff team. You're still good, but I think you just have to. I almost feel like I said that the train has sort of passed me by because I'm not ready to go nuts on LaRavia and say that he is like a top 20 pick or anything like that.
Top 40. We
Um,
agree top 40.
yes, I do agree with top 40. I
Okay.
think I've had him there for a while, but I think it's just sort of got to keep in mind, like a guy like Beauchamp, for example, where you said that you've
Oh,
seen
I
him in the
freaking love
30s.
that dude. I freaking love that dude.
Like he's a guy he doesn't have the shooting numbers, and I think there's a tendency to be like, well, then he'll never have the shooting numbers, but he finishes really, really well,
Yep.
and he seems to be comfortable with an elbow pull up, and he absolutely has the physicality to hang on the floor in any circumstance. So that to me is a bet I'd rather make and see if the shot comes along. Because in the NBA, the deeper you get in the playoffs, you see guys like that who aren't the best shooters, but they're so blessed defensively that if they get hot and they make three threes in a game, their team's probably going to win because of all the other things that they can do. And so those, again, when you're distinguishing between all these different kinds of wings, that is the wing I would rather take a shot on.
Oh, you and I are 100% in agreement. I struggle with where or how high should I put Beauchamp. Like at one point, I had him in the lottery, and then I kind of
Yeah.
moved him down. But I kind of really want to move him back up in that range because the more I think about it, like the less I don't think that he can't do on an NBA floor. Like he has so many strengths that point to him having value both in the open court and the half court. And then you throw in everything he can do defensively at his size with his length, and I'm like, why am I not putting this guy higher on my board? Because I don't believe in his on-ball creativity. Is that really the only reason why I shouldn't have him higher? And like he's a really nice player everywhere else in every other aspect. Like, yeah, he's how high do you have him to kind of like put a bow on this podcast? How where are you at on Beauchamp?
I have him like between 15 and 20. That's where I got him.
That's where I want
And
to have him.
I need to go back further into G League stuff because it has been a minute since I was watching that stuff very closely, to really solidify my opinions on those guys. But I
I think Dyson
yeah,
is the best long-term prospect that Ignite had, but in terms of the guy who blew me away the most, especially after seeing him in person, it was Beauchamp. I was 100% sold on Beauchamp, especially when I saw him in person.
yeah, it's a hacky thing to say, but some guys are just they're ready for it, and they just relish being on an NBA floor. They relish the physicality. They relish playing defense. They relish dirty work. Like like we said, Marjan isn't bereft offensively, and he's confident,
Yep.
and all that stuff plays. I don't know what sort of defender he projects as right away, but he's going to give someone problems on defense pretty early. And wings who can do that, teams find homes for them. So
He's a playmaker. He knows exactly when to double and when to trap, and he's got really quick hands to where he can poke the ball out. And if you get him out in transition, it I know you love Tari's, and in this respect, I give Tari credit. I think he's the best transition forward in this draft class. I don't consider him a wing. I consider Beauchamp a wing, and I would consider Beauchamp the best transition wing in this class. I don't know where you fall on that quote unquote
yeah,
positional line, but
I think that's right. And I actually have lowered just a skosh on Tari, just a
no,
little bit.
you had no, you didn't. No,
Not
you're
not
being
as I
silly.
still have him as a lotto pick. Don't
Okay.
get it twisted. I'm just I had been thinking of him as in like the 7-8 range, and I am a little lower than that. But we'll see. We'll see. There's figuring out what guys really fit next to star talent is tough, man. It's not an easy thing to do. That's why
No.
Malachi is like, I'll just make all my shots. You're like, well, I'll take that guy. Just
I
give me the
I
guy
would
who's going to make all
also
the shots.
I would
But
also take that guy. You'd be happy to know I've had Tari at 16 on my board for quite a while. So
yeah, I think it's a
you would
very
be
good
thrilled
spot
with
for
that.
him. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Chuck, we have accomplished everything that we set out to do on this podcast. This was incredible content as always. I certainly learned a lot, and I couldn't thank you more for coming on and sharing some of your knowledge. I know the audience will certainly appreciate this podcast as well. In case, for whatever reason, after having you on for the upteenth time, that they don't follow you already, please enlighten my audience where they can find you, your podcast, everything that you're doing.
Thank you very much. I am the Chucking Darts NBA and Draft podcast. That is wherever podcasts are. I am at Chucking Darts on Twitter, and like that's basically it. I think I technically have a YouTube channel, and I put like one segment of one episode on, but it's tough, man. So the grind is hard. You are one of the best grinders in the space, and I give you infinite credit because it is tough. But yeah, just follow me on Twitter. Nate is good enough to have me on and to retweet some of my episodes. So if you follow him, you'll eventually find me. But that's me at Chucking Darts.
I have told Chuck in private that he is doing the Lord's work with his NBA coverage and his NBA playoff coverage this year, and I sincerely mean that. Your episodes with Samson as well as Lauren were two of my favorite podcast episodes that I've listened to over the last about month and a half. I want to say that, right, that you did the Samson Folk podcast, like 3 to 4 weeks ago, if I'm
Yeah, a
correct.
couple weeks.
Lauren
It was
one was very recent.
right before the playoffs started because
Yep.
it was. I think it was in that week that was like play-in week, and then Lauren's was last week. So yeah, 2 weeks ago and a week ago. I'm not going to have an episode this week just because I don't have the time, but maybe Sunday night I'll have something and have it up Monday morning. I usually try to do at least one a week.
I would love to cover the playoffs more, but I have not watched enough NBA regular season basketball this year to feel like I can do playoff coverage justice because I have not been following all the trends. I mean, obviously I pay close enough attention to the league, but I don't feel like I've watched enough to really cover the playoffs and in the type of detail that I did last year, but really the type of depth that the playoffs deserve. So that's why I'm glad, Chuck, that you've done everything in that space that you have this year. And I've really appreciated your content. I know a lot of other people have appreciated your content out there. So
Thanks, man.
Keep doing the Lord's work. And meanwhile, I will try to do what I can in the draft space. Hopefully next year I'll be able to cover more NBA stuff because I really do miss watching as much as I have in the past. But this draft cycle is just taken everything out of me. This is one of my harder cycles that I've had to evaluate. I've been trying my hand at this. I think we're on like the 11th season now that I've really been trying my hand at draft work, and this has been one of the tougher classes to evaluate. So a lot of my time has been taken up.
It's easily the toughest one that I've evaluated. I think it's so hard. I think it's so hard. And I think that's interesting. That makes it fun because you have disagreements starting right at number one and going all the way down. But there are, I mean, I can just do the bit. And in addition to the guys we talked about, Tari Eason, Jeremy Sohan, Josh Minot, Julian Champagny, Kendall Brown, Marjan Beauchamp, these are wings. These are like real wings. And the opinions on them just vary so wildly. It's very hard to parse, but that's why you got to clutch on to stuff that's true. Guys who can shoot, very good. Guys who can defend good players, very good, and just go from there.
Well, certainly thank you so much, everyone out there, for listening to this podcast. Make sure you're following me on Twitter at Draft Deeper. Make sure you're subscribed to the Draft Deeper podcast, wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. And make sure you're subscribed to No Ceilings, NoCeilingsNBA.com, following us on Twitter at NoCeilingsNBA, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, No Ceilings TV. We have plenty more content in store. But until then, I thank you all for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.